Would it be legal if the CIA used a drone to kill an American on U.S. soil? What if that person was accused of, say, financing the enemy? Is that part of Washington's definition of an enemy combatant? And would they then be liable for such a killing? Well, that hypothetical scenario and Senator Rand Paul's 13-hour filibuster, which briefly delayed confirmation of John Brennan as CIA chief last week, again raised the question of what the government can and cannot do in the name of national security. But raising the question can itself be risky. According to a forthcoming documentary film, federal employees increasingly risk it all if they go public when their conscience says, my government has clearly crossed the line. Here is a glimpse of the film, Silenced.
Part of the purpose of doing what they've been doing for the last several years is to destroy you.
I never thought of myself as a whistleblower. Sometimes I go back and forth in my mind where I wish I had kept my mouth shut, and other times I wish that I had shouted it from the rooftops.
There is information that the public in a functioning democracy has a right to know.
Thomas Jefferson said that an informed citizenry is the crucial part of the democracy.
I took an oath. I had to deal with a government who was in violation of the oath, and I couldn't remain silent.
I could not live with myself knowing that another human being could be put to death because I kept my mouth shut.
Would you call it torture?
Waterboarding is probably something that we shouldn't be in the business of doing.
I was the first CIA officer to confirm the use of torture techniques against Al-Qaeda prisoners.
Our country had instituted a torture policy, and we ran head into that.
You're supposed to accept these things as normal because to the people who have been there, it is completely normal.
NSA would now instrument the United States of America for the purposes of dragnet blanket electronic surveillance on a vast scale.
I explained the facts of my case to my lawyer. He said, wow, you meet the classic textbook definition of a whistleblower.
We're people who join the government for all the good reasons, work for a number of years, and then confront something that just stops us.
The White House has approved it. It's all legal. As soon as he said it's all legal, the hair stood up on the back of my neck.
That's whistleblower Thomas Drake, a former senior executive with the National Security Agency, in the documentary Silenced. It's about the federal whistleblowers who publicly questioned U.S. national security policy after 9/11, and about the risks of truth-telling in what some call the age of unending war. Joining us to discuss the making of Silenced, producer and director James Spione, and featured in the film, whistleblower Jesselyn Radack, a former ethics attorney with the Department of Justice. Ms. Radack is now the National Security and Human Rights Director at the Government Accountability Project in Washington, D.C. Welcome, both of you. Thank you for doing this. And Jesselyn, you said in that clip that how could you not speak out if being silent meant somebody else's life might be taken? What were you referring to?
I was referring to the fact that at that time, the so-called American Taliban, John Walker Lind, was facing death penalty counts. And I know the line is different for every whistleblower in terms of when they blow the whistle, but for me, that was a line that I was not willing to cross. Tell us why you made this film.
I think just listening to Jesselyn right now kind of reminded me why. I was very attracted to the character of these people who were all in different agencies and all faced sort of different dilemmas. But I think at the core is this idea of someone willing to stand up on their conscience, on principle, and speak out in spite of the fact that they probably know very well, especially now, that there are going to be severe repercussions.
After the Rand Paul filibuster last week, the Senate, including with Paul's vote, did vote to confirm John Brennan as CIA director. There were 31 Republican no votes, and Leahy of Vermont, a Democrat, and Merkley of Oregon, a Democrat, also voted not to confirm, and the one independent, Bernie Sanders of Vermont. What to you does Brennan's choice say about the Obama administration's view of civil liberties versus national security concern?
It says that we are willing to reward people who engage in illegal and unethical and unconstitutional conduct, but if you dare expose that conduct, if it embarrasses the government or worse yet, exposes war crimes, you will be thrown in jail. It was a heartbreaking confirmation to me because Brennan, after all, pioneered the torture techniques and became the drone daddy of our country.
It seems that under Obama, we've had fewer conversations about waterboarding and torture, despite the nomination of Brennan and now confirmation of Brennan to be CIA director. Instead, we're talking about weaponized drones.
Right.
Why did the conversation switch topics, do you think?
Well, I think they switched policies. The torture, I mean, at least they claimed they were going to stop torture, and that was not approved anymore. And I think for some reason, President Obama and his advisors gravitated toward this new policy, which some have criticized as saying, well, it avoids the whole detention and torture thing entirely because you just get rid of people completely.
You connect these two issues in the film. How would you say they're connected?
Well, I think they're connected because it really is a connection between the Bush administration and the Obama administration. Even though the policies are different, I think there's this very clear continuity in claiming executive power, greater and greater executive power, and I think when it comes to the issues of terrorism and as you say, this idea of an unending war, it's kind of seen as almost a blank check, I think. Which is why it was sort of startling the other day for people when Rand Paul got up and on the Senate floor for hours and hours and questioned the president. I don't think we've seen that in a long time, a public challenging of presidential policy like that.
Obama uses something called the 1917 Espionage Act. He's used it at least 7 times. The most recent being an Arabic translator contracted by the Navy and charged with possessing classified documents. What is the Espionage Act, and why do you think Americans should be concerned with it today?
The Espionage Act is a little-known World War I era law that was meant to go after spies, not whistleblowers. Significantly, it was first used to go after Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg in 1970. That case collapsed with no charges being brought because of government misconduct. Then there were a few other people who had been charged under it, but then suddenly in 2010, Tom Drake was charged under the Espionage Act, which is one of the most serious charges you can level against an American. It basically says you are an enemy of the state, and what you did was out to harm the United States or benefit a foreign nation. It's an incredibly harsh hammer to use in overcharging people, particularly for telling the truth.
And what did Tom Drake actually do as you see it?
What Tom Drake actually did, he didn't disclose anything to anybody. He retained unclassified information about wrongdoing by the National Security Agency dealing with vast domestic sweeping surveillance of American citizens when there were programs available that were cheaper, effective, and could have protected people's privacy rights.
In the conservative National Review magazine, Kevin Williamson raised an interesting comparison to Vietnam in response to conservative columnist Charles Krauthammer. Williamson wrote, "If sympathizing with our enemies and propagandizing on their behalf is the equivalent of making war on the country, then the Johnson and Nixon administrations should have bombed every elite college campus in the country during the 1960s. Students in Ann Arbor, Michigan were actively and openly raising funds for the Viet Cong throughout the war." Now that was written a few weeks ago, and curiously enough, Rand Paul in his filibuster raised the specter of, well, they could have weaponized, droned out Jane Fonda, right? When she was displaying Viet Cong weaponry as a piece of theater and things like that. Do you think the Espionage Act has ever been used appropriately?
Well, I think there are a few cases, but certainly in the last last few years, it's clear that it's being used against people who aren't talking to foreign nations and actively trying to undermine the United States. They're talking to the press. And I think, you know, journalists and people like you should be very concerned about that. I mean, I think that seems to be almost a backdoor way, as someone like Thomas Drake would say, of sort of infringing on press freedoms. And if there's an irony to the title of my film, Silenced, in some ways these people haven't been silenced. They're here talking, with the possible exception of John Kiriakou, who is now in prison. But I think the silence refers to something bigger, and I think that's the kind of chilling effect, the example being made of these people. For how many whistleblowers that actually stand up, I really wonder how many people are keeping their mouths shut, because it's a very intimidating thing to see such extreme charges be brought against someone for speaking their conscience.
Now, we've been talking about the politics. Let's look now at whistleblowers' lives and some of the consequences displayed in the film of speaking out.
It wasn't until I was about an hour into this interview that I realized, wait a minute, they're investigating me.
The apparatus of the U.S. government was turned against me.
Every phone call you've ever made, emails you've ever sent, your bank statements, tax records.
I was trying to be honest and obey the law, and yet I'm the one who ends up having to hire a team of lawyers.
They set the target. They put the bullseye on me. It said, we're going to make an example of him.
I have to try to protect my children from being exposed to it. I've got the FBI surveilling me on and off for the last 7 months.
You have to mortgage your house. You have to empty your bank account.
I've applied for every job I can think of. Haven't gotten even an email or a call back.
The people that you used to work with have turned against you. Your neighbors are at least suspicious, because it's not every day that government investigators are knocking on their doors.
What has now happened to my family? It's a very tormented existence.
You're not loyal, you're not a good American, you're a terrorist sympathizer.
That secrecy regime, despite President Obama's pledges of transparency and openness, has only continued to expand.
I'm not the pushover that these guys think I am. I'm as tough as they are, and I'm gonna fight.
Excerpt from the trailer for the forthcoming documentary, Silenced. And that was ex-CIA agent John Kiriakou, who recently pleaded guilty to disclosing classified information, which included the name of a covert CIA officer, to a reporter. A father of 5, just last week, he began a 2.5-year sentence. And I understand you were both there as his prison term began last week. Tell us about it, Jesselyn, and were his children with him as well?
His children, his 5 children, did not go with him to prison. It would be way too traumatizing for that to have occurred. But it was absolutely heartbreaking. I'm one of John's attorneys, and it's been one of the most difficult cases for me professionally. I'm used to seeing whistleblowers like Tom Drake, who also has 5 kids, being blacklisted and bankrupted and broken. Normally, whistleblowers would get fired or have their security clearances pulled, but now, having them put in jail, that's something I could not have imagined in my wildest nightmares.
But he did plead guilty, and I'm not very familiar with his case, to a crime disclosing classified information, which included the name of a covert CIA officer to a reporter. We remember how big a deal it was when the name of a covert CIA officer was disclosed to the press by somebody in Vice President Cheney's office.
Right.
Why should we have a lot of sympathy for him in this case?
Well, that goes, I think, to the issue of selective prosecution and leaks that matter versus leaks that don't. You don't have to go back to the Bush administration. You can just look at what happened with the production of this film, Zero Dark 30, which had very high-level access, in which sources and methods and names were revealed, but those were apparently all approved. And so, you know, if you look at the letter of the law, you can see that it's not really applied equivalently. So why was it applied to John Kiriakou? Well, John Kiriakou was the first former CIA agent to confirm that waterboarding was policy. He started to be quite outspoken about it and changed his position on it into becoming sort of more critical of the policy. And you know, the CIA had been looking at this for many years. There had been reports internally in the CIA, and so he was basically on the list to as a problem, as someone who was talking out of turn, as someone who was saying things critical of what we were doing. And I think, you know, something that Jesselyn talks about a lot, quite obviously, torture was questionable policy, probably an illegal policy, and certainly, in my view, an immoral policy. And this is just something you're not allowed to criticize.
You want to add to that about the Kiriakou case?
Yeah, I would add that, you know, this case is not about exposing an undercover identity. It's not about leaking. If it were about leaking, our jails would be bursting, overflowing with people in Washington, D.C. who leak daily. It's about torture, and John did expose the torture program for the first time, acknowledging it publicly. He called waterboarding torture, and he said we shouldn't be doing this. And ever since he made that statement, the CIA has been gunning for him ever since 2007. This case is about torture, not about a name. And by the way, the person who did leak Valerie Plame's name, that was purely for political purposes, and he served no jail time.
How have you come through your ordeal? You were an ethics attorney at the Department of Justice when, as you were starting to get at before, the so-called American Taliban was questioned, and your revelations to Newsweek showed being questioned without being advised of his rights. And you blew the whistle on that. After that, I read that you were on the no-fly list for a while. What else happened to you, and how are things now with your own situation?
In my case, after I blew the whistle, I ended up being put under criminal investigation, though I was never told for what. I was referred to the state bars in which I'm licensed as an attorney based on a secret report that I had no access to. I was put on the no-fly list. I was forced out of my private sector job, and the government even assisted my private law firm in trying to take away the meager unemployment benefits I was granted. So it was a long number of years to get out from under this cloud, and the bar referral is still pending after more than 9 years.
How have your case and others affected the chill in Washington? Is it harder to be a whistleblower now? Is it harder to tell the truth if a government employee thinks there's an uncomfortable truth to be told?
I think it's much harder now that whistleblowers are actually being prosecuted, because not only are they going to risk getting fired and losing their job and their livelihood, their profession, and their ability to work in a given industry, but they may be forfeiting their liberty, decades in jail, the rest of their life in jail.
Do you have the money to finish this film? I understand it's still in post-production. And who's financing it? Who's interested in this?
I'm very thankful to the folks at Kickstarter for setting up that site, because partly it's being financed by small contributions from people on the web right now.
Kickstarter is everybody.
Yeah, well, right, and you know, so I've raised some funds for post-production for that. There's also going to be some other more conventional investment sources, and hopefully some pre-sales to Europe. I'm not the producer that really handles all that usually. I mean, I'm a director mainly and a creative guy, but it's being cobbled together.
And so we'll look for this in about a year?
Yeah, we'll be in post-production probably for most of this year.
But so relevant right now with what's been going on that we wanted to feature this today.
Well, I really appreciate it. And, you know, I just wanted to say, it's very fresh in my mind, having accompanied John Kiriakou to jail. I was there when he parted from his children and his wife. You know, I just have to say, you know, as a documentary filmmaker, I struggle to stay objective, but I'm trying to feel my way through these subjects, because that's what's important about it. And to see someone's freedom taken from them because of something they said was a very disturbing thing for me. And it's one of the things that really, for me, makes this whole topic very potent.
Thank you both very much for coming in.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks very much.